So in class, this is where we finished off. We were looking at the appendages and the accessory structures of the skin, so everything in the skin other than the cutaneous membrane, the epidermis and the dermis. So we finished off looking at the exocrine glands of the skin. Exocrine because they are making secretions into ducts that are going to empty onto the surface of the epidermis, right, the epithelial that makes up the outer layer of the skin. So we looked at our two types of sudoriferous or sweat glands. We had the eccrine sweat glands, and the eccrine sweat glands had the primary function of thermoregulation. They release a secretion that's mostly water, has some dissolved salts, some metabolic waste in there as well. Then we have the apocrine sweat glands. Those are isolated in the genital region, in the armpits. They become most active around puberty, and that releases a sweat that's not necessarily helping with thermoregulation. It's a sweat that contains a few more fatty acids and proteins. It causes it to be milky or yellowish in color. And those, when mixed with bacteria, give the wonderful scent of body odor. And then the last type of exocrine gland that we looked at were the sebaceous glands. Those are the oil-secreting glands. That oil secretion is called sebum. The sebum goes directly onto the hair within the follicle, and then the hair brings the sebum up to the surface of the skin, and some will stay on the hair. The oil acts as a conditioner, keeps everything moist, protects our hair, protects our skin. While oil ducts can cause acne and we don't like oily hair, it's a natural conditioner that we have for our outer layers of our body. So the next thing that we're going to look at is the hair. Okay, so hair provides the function of protection. It protects our skull from UV radiation. We have hair at openings around our body, right? Hair covering our eyes, hairs in our nose, hairs in our ears. Those help to prevent things from entering into those cavities that we have inside of our body. So when we're talking about a hair, the follicle is essentially going to be the structure that's located within the dermis, within the skin. The hair follicle is going to be producing the actual hair. So the root is going to be the internal portion of the follicle. We'll look at some pictures in a second to kind of help us get a view of what these structures look like. The shaft is what we're looking at when we see hair and coming out of our skin. So the shaft is the exposed portion of the hair, so the hair we see in our head. Once it's out of the follicle, it's called the shaft. And the beautiful thing when we talk about hair and nails is that it works very similarly to the epidermis. They're made of keratinocytes, so they're cells that are producing keratin. The keratin makes our hair and our nails really strong and tough. It makes it waterproof. And it makes a good external barrier to protect the different parts of our bodies. And just like we have melanocytes in our skin to give our skin its color, we also have melanocytes that produce different quantities of melanin and different colors of melanin to provide different hair colors for different people. We said that the hair and the nails are going to work very similarly to the epidermis. And so what we're going to see is that at the base of the hair follicle is where we're going to have the hair matrix. And the hair matrix is going to be the layer of cells that's directly around the blood supply that we have at the base of the hair follicle. It's going to be in the hair bulb, which if you look at the follicle, it's going to get a little bit bigger at the base. That portion is known as the bulb. And within the bulb, we're going to have blood vessels, and those matrix cells are going to be right around the blood vessels, so that's where we're producing new keratinocytes that are pushing old keratinocytes to the surface of the hair follicle. And by the time they get to the superficial layer of the follicle, and when we're looking at the actual hair shaft, they're just dead keratinocytes, very similar to the stratum corneum we have of our epidermis. So, here's just a view of some of those basic structures. We're going to look at the erector pili muscle in a second. So if you look at the very top, we have our hair shaft. Oops, sorry, can't click. So that's the portion of the hair that's protruding out of the skin. If you look, the hair extends deep into this structure. That's going to go deep into the dermis. It's going to go through the papillary layer, all the way through the reticular layer. And that's the actual hair follicle. if you remember when we were talking about sebaceous glands, the oil gets secreted directly into that follicle, so you can see the sebaceous glands tightly incorporated into that follicle. The follicle we're going to see has two different layers. It's going to have an epithelial layer and a connective layer, and that's essentially going to anchor the hair within the dermis. The root's going to be the hair that's located inside the follicle, and this is the little bulb I was talking about at the bottom. It gets a little bit bigger at the base. Around this little space in the middle of the bulb, we're going to see that's called the hair papilla. That's where the blood vessels are, so the hair matrix would be right around that space where the keratinocytes in our hair follicle are going to be undergoing a high rate of mitosis to produce new keratinocytes to help our hair grow. So what we're going to see in the next slide is those two portions of the hair follicle. It's going to have an epithelial root sheath and a fibrous sheath, right? So the fibrous sheath is going to be connective tissue. The epithelial root sheath is going to be epithelial tissue like we have in the epidermis. We're going to see the hair papilla. That's going to be at the base of the follicle. That's going to be the space we just saw in the previous picture that's full of blood vessels. And that's going to provide nutrients to those dividing keratinocytes so we can produce our hair. And the erector pili muscle is attached to the hair follicle. So that was the muscle we also saw in the previous picture. That's the muscle that when it contracts, we get goosebumps and it causes our hair to stand straight up. So while those functions are not very useful for us right now, evolutionarily speaking, right, when an animal is afraid or if we're afraid, the erector pili contracts and that causes our hair to stand up. If we were still hairy animals that had a lot of fur, by causing the hair to stand up, it gives you an increase in the appearance of your size and it kind of plays an evolutionary role in that sense. Same thing with when we're cold, we get goosebumps. The erector pili muscle is going to contract, and by causing the hair to stand straight up, it creates more of a barrier between the outside cold and your internal environment, therefore helping keep you warm. So while these aren't things that they're really doing for us now, at some point when we had more hair on the surface of our skin, that would be a beneficial function of the erector pili muscle. So here we're getting a closer look at the hair follicle and also the hair bulb, right? So we're at the bottom of the follicle. You can see in blue on the outermost portion of the hair follicle, that's the fibrous sheath. So it's essentially just connective tissue that we would have in our dermis. And then we have our epithelial root sheath, and that's just going to be made of keratinocytes. At the base of that hair bulb, we have the hair papilla. So the hair papilla is connective tissue that's going to be in the middle of all these keratinocytes. It contains the blood vessels, and then the hair matrix are those cells right around that hair papilla. The hair matrix cells take all those nutrients from our blood vessels so they can undergo mitosis at a high rate, right? It's like the basal layer of the epidermis. Same thing in the basal layer of the epidermis, we have some melanocytes. Those melanocytes are going to be producing melanin. The melanin gets packaged in melanosomes. The melanosomes get taken up into the keratinocytes, and that's what gives our hair its different colors. So important thing to know, right, is that the hair follicle holds the hair in place. At the base of the hair bulb, we have a nice blood supply. It's in the hair papilla. The hair matrix is where our cells are undergoing a high rate of mitosis. They can do so because they have all the nutrients, and then we have melanocytes at the base that are also responsible for giving our hair its color. Now, if we take a cross-section of the hair, we can see that there are three different layers. So the innermost layer is the medulla, the middle layer is the cortex, and then the outside layer is the cuticle. So the layers can differ in the amount of keratin. The cuticle is our portion of our hair that is most highly keratinized. It makes sense. It's the outermost layer. It's going to be exposed to more external stressors. So the extra keratin that we have in those keratinocytes is just going to help protect the hair overall. So the cuticle looks like shingles. You have these overlapping dead keratin-filled keratinocytes, and what happens is if they're exposed to a lot of heat, a lot of chemicals, maybe you dye your hair a lot or you straighten your hair a lot, It can cause the keratinocytes to separate within the cuticle and the layers start to split, and that's when you see split ends at the distal ends of your hair shafts. Another cool thing about these different layers of the hair, they correlate with how permanent hair dyes are. So if you ever were to dye your hair, you can get permanent, semi-permanent, or obviously if you are dyeing your hair for Halloween or you're doing something just temporarily, we can have temporary hair dye. So the different types of hair dye just penetrate different portions of the hair. The more permanent the hair dye, the deeper it's going to permeate into the hair shaft. So we're looking at penetrating to the medulla if it's a permanent hair dye. If it's a semi-permanent, permanent hair dye, reaching the cortex. And then obviously hair dyes that you just wash off in the shower are just essentially coating that cuticle layer and not getting very deep into the hair. So the last thing we're going to look at are nails. So nails are just highly keratinized, scale-like modifications of the epidermis. So they're keratinocytes. They're producing the most keratin, which is why your nails are really, really hard. And unlike your hair and your nails, there aren't any melanocytes there, so we're not going to have any color, right? Our nails are colorless. And we're going to see that the nail bed is going to be underneath the actual hard part of the nail, which is the nail body. Underneath that is the stratum basale, the basal layer of our epidermal cells, and that's going to help the nails to grow. So what I want to do is look at the picture when we're talking about these different structures. So we're going to look at the free edge, the body, the nail folds such as the cuticle, the root, and the nail matrix. So the free edge of the nail is the white portion that you see extending off the surface of the finger, right? So it appears white. There's no skin underneath because what gives the nail its pink color, right? It's not melanin because there aren't any melanocytes there. It's just the dermal blood supply that we have in the underlying layers of the dermis. So you can see the picture of the lateral cross section, and you can see the actual blood vessels underneath the nail bed, and that's what gives that pink coloring. The little white crescent, the lanule at the base of the nail, if you look at the picture, it doesn't have blood vessels there, so it's the lack of dermal blood supply in that particular area that causes that white crescent that forms at the base of the nail. The nail body is the hard exposed portion of your nail, the portion of your nail that you might paint. The nail body lies on the nail bed. So the nail bed is just that underlying layer of epithelial cells. Think of like a body laying literally on a bed. And then nail folds are just layers of the skin that cover the nail body. So we have some lateral folds, and we also have a proximal fold, right? So it's near the attached base of the nail. That's the cuticle. If you ever get a manicure, they tend to push those back, and they'll clip back that excess skin that might be forming on the cuticle. That just exposes more of the nail body, so you have more nail to actually paint. The root of the nail is the portion of the nail that extends into the skin, so you can't see it. It's basically everything proximal to the nail body. And then just like the hair matrix is where we're producing new keratinocytes in the hair, the nail matrix is where we're producing more keratinocytes to help our nails grow. So the last thing is the developmental aspects of the skin and the body. So it starts by talking about some things related to the integumentary system that you might see in a newborn. So lanugo is just that white little peach fuzz that you can see in that image. It's the first type of hair that we form during fetal development. It generally forms by the 5th or 6th month of fetal development, and it'll disappear by birth. So generally you're not going to see this. Obviously, if it's a premature baby, it might be something that might be encountered. Vernix caseosa is another name for cradle cap. It's an increase in the production of sebaceous glands. Those sebaceous glands produce oil, right? And oil protects our skin. So when the baby's about to leave the nice, warm, cozy environment of the mother and be exposed to the very intense, dry, outer external environment, it has an increase in the sebaceous glands right before birth, and that causes that white crusty appearance, which is just Vernix caseosa.